Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone for joining us today. I'm Lily McElwee. I am a fellow and deputy director at the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS in Washington, D.C. Delighted to welcome you to today's event. We'll be looking into managing European dependencies on China for climate technologies and the broader theme of de-risking amid the clean energy transition. Advancing the green transition is clearly a major policy priority for Brussels and many European member states today, but given that China is really an important part of climate technology supply chains, policymakers are now grappling with the important security and economic questions about trade-offs and where and how quickly to de-risk. This is a very timely topic on the back of the climate conference that just wrapped up, the EU-China summit, and recent announcements from the European Commission about trade investigations into various clean energy products. But it's also very timely because we're launching a report by my friend and colleague, Ilaria Mazzocco, who is a senior fellow in the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS. Her report looks into these trade-offs as European policymakers begin to think about the scale and scope of de-risking in clean technologies and how leaders can think about and manage these dependencies going forward. I'm really delighted to introduce an all-star panel that's going to react and discuss Ilaria's paper and this topic. So we have Agatha Kratz, who is a director at the Rhodium Group, where she heads the China Corporate Advisory Team and the research in relations. Agatha holds a PhD from King's College London and worked at various China-focused think tanks in Europe. We also have Loyle Campbell, who's a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, following the geopolitics of the energy transition, and he has experience working on energy and climate in civil society, government, and industry on both sides of the Atlantic. And we also have Alicia García-Herrero, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel and chief economist for the Asia Pacific at French investment bank Natixis. She also holds positions at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Singapore National University, and is a member of the advisory board of MERIX. So we're delighted to have you all here. We're going to begin by hearing from Ilaria. She's going to give us a presentation of her paper, which we're looking forward to. And then we'll go to reactions from our panelists. So Ilaria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lily. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to have such a distinguished group of panelists to discuss this topic, which I've been thinking a lot of lately, not just in the European case, but also for other countries. But I think Europe actually provides some of the more interesting and urgent challenges moving forward. Before I start talking, I actually wanted to thank my team and a special shout out to Andrea Palazzi and our wonderful interns, Vicky Tu and Jessica Shao, who helped me with some of the data for this report, and of course the European Climate Foundation that made it possible. So, as I said, there is a very interesting and complex dilemma that is I think, becoming clearer and clearer as we move forward in terms of de-risking in climate technologies and how this is affecting and shaping climate policy. Now, why, the issue itself is shaped by the industry, which over time has become highly concentrated in China. Part of the reason for this is just that the market in China is so large. And so a lot of the spending and the investment is happening within China. As you can see from this chart, this is clean energy spending broadly speaking. But of course, if you look at the specific technologies, something like 60% of all EV sales last year were in China, and this has been the case for several years now. 40% of all wind installed capacity is in China. About a third of all solar installed capacity is in China. So this is a huge market. In addition, on top of that, you have massive industrial policy spending, which has supported the industry over the past few years, and then a broader sort of manufacturing advantage and the whole system support for manufacturing in China, which has really sort of made it possible for these industries to become so highly concentrated in China. The result of this is, of course, that not just now do we see that there's a lot of manufacturing in China, but in the future, this advantage is expected to continue despite de-risking policies, which of course will make a difference, but will be still small compared to the overall concentration that's expected to continue to be in China. Now, this chart shows battery manufacturing capacity. Those who are familiar with these technologies know that it looks fairly similar for other technologies with different, different relative concentration. Of course, solar farm are concentrated in China. When you look at wind or certain less mature technologies, it's a little less concentrated in China. But of course, this is sort of pointing at the broader issue where countries have become increasingly dependent on China, and that's what's driving sort of that backlash in terms, and which the derisking is sort of reflective of. Of course, that concentrated capacity becomes more obvious when you look at the exports. So electric vehicles are sort of an interesting case, but because it really highlights one of the drivers, which is that manufacturing capacity, which is in China, is not present elsewhere right now. So EVs, of course, there's been an increase in demand in Europe, and that demand has been met by a surge of exports from China, which is where all the manufacturing capacity is right now, because of course that's where the market was up until now. So what we've seen in this, obviously this chart, these numbers are what have concerned the Commission when it launched its investigation. We've seen that the surge in demand in Europe has been met by that increase in exports from China. When we look at who is exporting, it's not just Chinese companies, of course, right? So you do have about half of all those companies are Chinese. The exports are, these overall exports, not just to Europe, but there's a significant amount that is Western companies. A very significant amount is Tesla itself. So this may change, obviously, as more manufacturing capacity comes online in Europe. And this is something to keep in mind, that these relative numbers can be changed over time as that manufacturing capacity becomes more distributed. But overall, this picture, I think, really sort of gives you a sense of the dilemma for policymakers. On the one hand, production in China is correlated with low costs, which has made possible the widespread deployment of these technologies over time in many countries. Obviously, China being the main one, but in many countries. And so those costs are very important. But of course, there are significant risks. And we saw with COVID that we don't even have to go as far as weaponization to see that there are risks with over-reliance on a single country for an export, especially when that export is sort of central to your energy system. So that, of course, usually the traditional way of responding to this is trade defense measures, but those trade defense measures will raise costs and could have the risk, could slow the transition. This is a particularly tricky situation for, on the climate side, because it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a political economy side to the energy transition. And so in order to secure continued support, political support for the energy transition, policymakers are going to have to be able to deliver on energy security and economic welfare. So, the investments that are made for the energy transition are going to have to translate to some kind of growth or employment domestically in order to sustain that support. This all points to, the core question is, can that manufacturing advantage that made it possible to produce these technologies at a low cost in China, can it be reproduced outside of China? And this is a question that I'm going to be continuing to look at, because I think it's particularly interesting when looking at Chinese companies as they internationalize and seeing whether or not they can reproduce those costs outside of China, even when they're not benefiting from all the the correlation of sort of advantages, industrial policy, manufacturing advantage, scale, etc., which are present in China, and of course clustered economies as well. So I think these are some important factors. I think one important way forward is actually identifying risks more clearly. There's been sometimes a conflation of economic, national security, and energy security risks. I think actually distinguishing them more clearly and across technologies, the risks are quite different, can help us also think through what some policy responses can be. Of course, there's within the economic risk realm, even there are differences to what can be the disruption to supply chains, which we mentioned earlier, right? So exports could be disrupted to actually disruption to employment or sources of growth for the domestic economy. Of course, in the case of the automotive industry, this is partly why it's going to be such a big fight internationally. This is something that could affect core innovation and manufacturing for some countries. It's going to affect employment and disrupt certain legacy industries. And so I think that this is going to be a particularly interesting and, of course, challenging area for policymakers to address. I think it's interesting, and in the paper I look at the battery industry to see exactly what's happening there, because this, when you look at the numbers that we collected, and I know that Agatha recently published a report in which she looked at some of the similar numbers. When you look at numbers, it's clear that foreign direct investment is going to play a significant role in the expansion of manufacturing capacity in Europe for batteries. Of course, there are some European companies like Northvolt which are going to play an important role, but when we look at and this chart is online for those who want to play around with it. When you look at the future capacity, which is going to increase significantly, Chinese investment, and here specifically, I categorize companies that are owned by, factories that are owned by Chinese companies, is going to play a non-insignificant but not overwhelming role. So 23.5% is enough to make a difference. It's not enough to, I think, present a national security threat. And so I think, thinking about it in these terms where you can analyze and monitor sort of relative ownership and the relative distribution of these investments could be a helpful way of thinking about risk and managing risk moving forward. Of course, there's differences across different countries. Hungary is going to have, thanks to the massive CATL factory, is going to have a far more concentrated Chinese investment, but it's going to be far more distributed over the union overall. So I think this gets us to sort of the concluding the big trends to watch. I think the anti-subsidy investigation for EV exports from China is going to be very important. It could, of course, lead to tariffs, so it could be important for the specific industry, but it will also be interesting to see how it plays out and how it might affect other industries, and whether or not it might provide a model both within the European Union, but also for other countries. Certainly, I think here in Washington, people are watching this very closely. And I know also in other countries as well. Of course, overcapacity is the buzzword right now. Actually thinking of how this applies to industries such as the EV industry is going to be interesting, I think important. Of course, this is a term that has been used a lot in the past to talk about commodities like steel, aluminum, and so it's interesting to think about it in a different sort of context for a different type of industry. And finally, I think it's going to be really important to think about what Chinese domestic policy is right now and how it's changing. Industrial policy in China is not static; it is highly dynamic, actually, and so we are going to probably continue to see differences and variation, and this is going to continue to be, I think, a source of tension internationally, and that's going to be. It's going to be interesting to watch how Beijing actually decides to respond to it. Beijing is well aware of what the concerns are internationally. We, of course, just had the summit, the EU-China summit, where a lot of these issues came to the fore. And well, I said finally earlier, but really finally, I think interesting is going to continue to be watching what the challenges for multinationals are. Obviously, a lot of these technologies emerge at a time of supply chain integration, globalization. And so as governments now think about this in a more geopolitical environment, it becomes harder to disentangle what is national and what is international. When you start looking at the corporate structures of a lot of companies, you find that not only are they intrinsically linked sometimes with Chinese companies, but their innovation systems go through China. And so I think this is going to be a challenge that policymakers are also going to have to continue to contend with and think through. I'll stop here. Just a reminder that a lot of the data here that I mentioned is available in the report. And I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ilaria, for that presentation and your report, which I think really compellingly highlights the balancing act, as you call it, between the European and the European Union, but also other economies will face as they're thinking about how to advance climate priorities, economic growth, national security. I definitely want to get reactions from our panelists. I think we'll start with Agatha and Alicia. Agatha first, Alicia, to get your sense of, from the European Union perspective, any diversification in how different economies are responding on this issue. And then we'll turn to Loyle, who I think is going to take us through the German case, which will be really interesting. So before I turn it over to you, Agatha, I do want to remind our audience that we will be taking questions. You can submit your questions on our event page, and we'll have some members of our team looking at those. So appreciate your contributions as well. But Agatha, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lily, for the introduction, and also Ilaria for an excellent report. I was looking at it yesterday and just noted down and started thinking about a few things. I would say today a few comments and reactions from reading it. And I think there are three main ideas, there were three main things that came out of it that I wanted to relate today. The first one is to note that in your paper, you look at EV, batteries, and solar, which are really cases where dependencies on China are already extremely entrenched, right? And that makes for a very relevant case study for the debate we're having right now on the approaches we should take to those more mature technologies where we have very high exposure. But I think it's interesting to think about as well and to devote enough attention to protecting and propping up and coming technologies and just kind of the future of certain green tech. What I like with the EU EV probe, and I hope we speak about the EU EV probe a lot because there's a lot to say about it, is that it's preemptive, right? It says we're going to try and prevent harm that will happen in the future and that hasn't happened yet. And it wants to avoid kind of a solar PV redux all over again in Europe, right? But there's much more that Europe, I think, can and probably should be doing as well to avoid a battery and EV redux too, because the place where we are with EV and battery at the moment puts us in a situation where the dominance that China has on the value chain here puts us in a position where we have to question whether or not we open an EV probe, right? And that is in and of itself a problem, because if there is subsidization and there is unfair trade practices and an unlevel playing field, of course we should be opening a probe, right? So there is just something to say. And there's three examples here I wanted to bring in that are going to be very interesting looking forward. The first one is in the wind industry, because here the dependencies are somewhat more manageable, but they might grow very quickly in the future because of China's price advantage and growing price advantage around fiberglass and carbon fiber composites. And so that's one to watch, right? Where we still have a little bit of a better positioning than we do on EV and batteries and solar, certainly. But should be looking out. Green hydrogen is another one, because despite China-made alkaline electrolyzers, which are less efficient overall than the PM electrolyzers that Europe is so good at, those technology and the Chinese technology here might come to dominate the market just because of a price advantage, right? And you point yourself that it's not just subsidies and it's not just state support, it's a lot of scaling up and the ability to be on such a massive market. But nevertheless, right, we're facing a situation that could end up in the same kind of in the same kind of place in 5 years' time or something. And the last one is heat pumps. We put it out in our latest report as well, where China's global export market share has tripled over the past decade, right? And so we're seeing signs here that you could have some of the same things happening. So just like thinking ahead to up and coming technologies as well, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have to ask ourselves, do we actually open a TDI investigation when we very certainly should, given the given the detail we see on the ground. The second point is one you make, but I want to underline really, really strongly here, which is the political dimension of derisking, and especially the reshoring conversation. And this is in the context of the EU-China summit, where we've heard from the Chinese side that Europeans should take advantage of cheap China-made green tech goods, right? It's good for them, it's good for the green transition, just take it. But you can't build support for the green transition without job creation. That doesn't happen, else you're going to be voted out, and your voters are going to, in democratic system, which is where we live, are going to elect populist climate skeptic leaders, right? And that happened elsewhere. I'm not going to cite any country here, but it can happen in the future again. And so the US has understood this, put a lot of money on the table, has been very proactive there. But I would argue that we need to be thinking in the same terms. And so we need to give a slightly higher coefficient than maybe what comes out in your report. You put cost versus kind of employment in the same basket. I would weigh down the employment side of the balance because you can't have a green transition without that. So very important that you did underline it, especially on your slide with the different consideration. And then just that means that I'm therefore quite in alignment with your viewpoint that Chinese FDI in Europe should be mostly welcome, right? Especially because it creates job opportunities. Of course, the plants that are being built, but also upstream, downstream, all of the ecosystem that goes with those manufacturing plants. It brings know-how, and there's a lot of places where we've lost know-how and we've lost the ability to make certain green technologies, and so we need to get that back. And so FDI is one way, and it's a very, very good way of transferring that. And because the capital that comes with it and the scale that comes with it is absolutely, it should absolutely be welcome. There's just two caveats here that I would underline, is that the competitive dynamics of those investments should be monitored closely, because China can export market distortion also through investment, right? And the ability to invest in an 8 billion plant somewhere in Europe, I won't cite the country, is in and of itself a distortion if it creates a very, very low price environment where the Verkors and Northvolts of the world can't thrive and can't develop and can't build their own scale, right? And so this is just something to keep in mind, that you can have market distortions that are problematic. And of course, it doesn't solve the problem of where your inputs come from and your graphite come from and all of this. But that's a whole other discussion. And that gets back to your core idea, which is to say it's an inescapable balancing act between welcoming FDI, welcoming cheap Chinese products for pragmatic reasons, but making sure that we also develop a homegrown capacity that we can rely on if anything happens. Doesn't have to be economic coercion, could also be another COVID, right? But just that we have the ability to also stand on our 2 feet should something happen. And here, I think in the past, and I will reiterate that, there's an option to have a two-pronged approach. You can have a public procurement system that is somewhat preferential to local players and gives them a chance. And then you can make sure that consumer-facing products and more commoditized products are purchased from Chinese sources at a lower price, right? I mean, there are a number of ways that you can think about just having a kind of two-channel approach. And then last point, I think that comes out in your report, a lot of it is about EU, China, and how the dynamic works. I think there's a lot that Europe needs to do as well to get its act together to solve all of the problems you're pointing to. It's not just about China, it's about Europe itself. Putting on the table real financial support for the green transition and not getting bogged down into Germany-like deadlocks on budgets, because that obviously is a very bad sign at the moment for anyone investing in the energy transition, the green energy transition, green transition. Working on our single market, because we don't have enough scale at the moment, that it makes sense to build enormous factories the way that we need them. And finally, I mean, I don't see a lot of suggestion in your paper that we should work with alliance partners, but I think we should. In the same sense that I think scale in China is a type of subsidy, and we've made that point repeatedly in different papers. You need to build, if you're going to be competitive, you don't just need to put money on the table, you need to build scale. And you can build scale in Europe through a single market that works, but you can build scale with allies and partners by making absolutely sure that our markets are interoperable. Whether the US lets us do this, I don't know, but at least Europe should be trying really, really hard for this to happen. So let me post here, but I thought it was a fantastic paper, really, really well done.
Thank you so much, Agatha. You've given us a lot to discuss already. I really want to get into the transatlantic dimension, the EV probe you mentioned, and the political dimension as well. But first, would love to turn it over to Alicia for your thoughts.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I want to thank Ilaria and the team for a wonderful paper. We happen to have been working on the same topic, a paper that we published at Bruegel with a slightly different title, but very similar in essence to this paper. Ours is basically derisking and decarbonizing, or while decarbonizing, but we ended up using this title for something which, in a way, I'm going to argue is an alternative to China's FDI, which is, I understand where Agatha is coming from. We just finished a podcast yesterday with a Chinese colleague from Caixin, who made the same point. I mean, just accept our FDI, and that's the best way out, because, but Agatha, he didn't make the point of all of the jobs we would create. He made the point about overcapacity of engineers in China coming to Europe to build this plant. So, on that note, I'm going to move to a few comments. But let me finish with the title of our paper, which is that opposite kind of, not opposite, but alternative, put it this way, a proposal, which is a partnership, a green tech partnership to, in a way, solve the issue of only reshoring, which I agree is frankly impossible, including with Chinese FDI, because the price is just not competitive. We have a few graphs in our papers showing that. But rather to rely on others to produce for, in our partnership, both the US and Europe. So convincing the US that maybe reshoring and huge subsidies is not the way to go, at least not forever, and trying to produce elsewhere in a kind of partnership, which would be complementary to China's current supply chain. So that's kind of the idea of the paper. But let me go back a little bit to Ilaria's paper and try to complement those ideas, which again are very similar in the diagnostics part of the exercise. We focus on solar, wind, and EV. So it's a little bit, and I think Agatha mentioned this already. I think I would focus very much on solar to show what might happen. I mean, solar is kind of, in a way, a good example of where we might be if we do nothing, because that's exactly, what happened to solar from 2014 in that, old investigation, which the EU decided to stop at the WTO, and the consequences of it all. And the consequences are that the dependence is much higher as of now than for EVs or wind turbines. We're talking about 90% of our imports coming from China, and that's basically the global average. And the argument that you hear from there's actually a full book on this by Wen Shengpen, CICC Institute, chief economist of CICC Institute, making this strong argument: you can't fight economies of scale for something that is a public good. If any economist, including myself, comes with a different argument, raise your hand. You're not an economist, kind of idea. And I think this is why whatever we do now will be extremely important, because once you get to 90%, how do you replicate those economies of scale? I mean, where and how is very difficult. So I think, in a way, breaking that situation for solar panels is essential, but also not repeating the solar panel case elsewhere. So in that paper, again, to make this point, we go through the 4 ways in which we're dependent on China. It's well known. Perhaps one is less well known, but let me go through them. One is, of course, extraction of raw materials. So we go through the critical raw materials. We go through all of them. Refining, even worse. and manufacturing. Obviously, I already gave the numbers. We go through different aspects of the supply chain, so you see where the choke points are within each of the supply chain. So, PVs is basically wafers, or, you name it. But the fourth is innovation. And this is literally our numbers come from DG Growth, so meaning from the Commission itself, showing that scientific publications in all of the green tech that Agatha has mentioned, including heat pumps, where supposedly we are, is by now dominated by China. I wonder whether this is the case for patents, especially international patents, but this is something we're actually now investigating. But the point is, when you look at it up, from the distance, or at least looking at those numbers, you wonder, I mean, basically, when champagne argument, there's nothing anybody can do, because it's not only about pricing of manufacturing, it's about everything else. And take it or leave it. So I think it's important to realize where we are. And again, looking at solar panels, where we might be with other industries very soon. And the question is, why the risk? I mean, if this is already so self-evident that it's just so hard, and why not, take it. We develop the economies of scale, it's right there. And if you really suffer, bring us with you to your, to your market. You may as well give us some subsidies, because the cost is going to be double. But basically take us with us. So for me, there's a number of arguments why we should de-risk in this partnership mode. I mean, beyond the obvious, which is retaliation, which everybody can understand. There's other arguments. I think the most compelling argument is that there's two that I want to offer, hopefully compelling enough. One is that there could be instances in which China needs to keep more of this. First of all, there could be instances in which China might not be able to produce enough of this green tech for reasons beyond their own willingness to retaliate. Could be anything. It could be a major shock. It could be, just think about the world, I don't know, in the 70s, yeah? And we already had quite a shock twice, 73, 79. And never on earth was oil as concentrated as solar panels are today. You may say that this is just part of the renewables, we can use others, but in essence, it looks scary, even without the scenario of retaliation, simply because anything could happen to any country in the world. We saw that in Taiwan. Taiwan certainly didn't want to retaliate anybody in September 2021. And because of the drought and because of other reasons, semiconductors could not be shipped. And that's something that I think we can't forget, that that level of concentration is simply very dangerous. The second one is, and by the way, that FDI elsewhere would limit. You see, that first risk would of course be softened by going to Europe to produce. The second one is this, I think, important idea that the demand for renewables is increasing everywhere. I mean, put it this way, it should increase even faster if we were to keep, our promises, but I'll leave it there. But maybe that's why we have overcapacity. But, if everybody were doing what we're supposed to do to reach our targets, maybe there wouldn't be any overcapacity, if you think about it. So if China is planning ahead, on the basis of people complying with their countries complying with their emissions targets and keeping their share of the export market, which by now is extremely large, as I mentioned, for PVs, and which for China's production, by the way, is about 2/3. So China exports 2/3 of its green tech. So if China wants to first decarbonize itself, which also is somehow behind the curve as for the rest of the world, and continue to serve the world or feed the world in its decarbonization, can China produce all of this? And this might sound counterintuitive because we are in an overcapacity mentality here, but it's only because, first, many are not yet in the race, let's face it, say India, and also because we're all late. So the question is, imagine we get very high temperatures, everybody gets very nervous, and suddenly everybody chases green tech. I mean, rather than, what would happen? Will China export green tech or keep green tech? I mean, and I think all of these uncertainties are important to realize that we just can't rely on a single country for things that we don't even know whether they're going to be overcapacity or no capacity. I mean, not enough capacity for something as important as decarbonization. So, for me, all of these big questions are, in a way, called for action. And again, why not? I wouldn't say that I would oppose FDI from China. I wouldn't be as strong as that, but I don't think can be the only solution, because it brings us back to a very costly decarbonization, unless we're thinking of, basically China replicating their production models, whether it's in terms of the amount of capex, labor costs, you name it, innovation, bringing the patents, everything, and just replicates. And even doing that, in our paper, we have a estimation of the cost of producing PVs in different areas of the world, and it's just very difficult. I find it very difficult, even with a lot of FDI from China, to reduce that cost. So as of now, the solar PV model manufacturing cost per region in dollar terms per watt is 0.56 for the US, 0.52 for Europe, 0.24 for China. So basically, it's more than double. But our partnership option is what? Southeast Asia, 0.26. So, the point is, why get trapped, sorry to say that, even with the help of China's FDI, into a production mode, which is in our shores, but still very expensive? I mean, I can't see the benefit of that in a way. So I'm going to leave it here just to say that, yes, I hear that and I understand it, but I think creating a supplementary supply chain elsewhere where it's also cheap and where you have a second option, and that maybe I don't want to say you dominate or control. Those are words I wouldn't like to say, but I say them just to avoid them. Saying, whether you have a partnership where you finance, you share technology, but in a way you make sure it's cheap and where you can have the economies of scale that you may not be able to have in Europe, notwithstanding our single market, for reasons that we might not be able to get that single market in time for a decarbonization. That's my concern. So that's all from my side.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alicia. I really appreciate that. First of all, the conceptual why we need to de-risk in the first place, I think taking it out of the China context and thinking about why those over dependencies are bad at a conceptual level is important, but also getting into the FDI question. And there's certainly more we can talk about there. But Loyle, you've been so patient, and I definitely want to get into your reactions and the German case. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lily, and thank you as well, Ilaria, and fellow panelists for joining this conversation. I think, and for the lovely paper. It was very, very interesting to read it. I really appreciated the graphical representations. I do think it's important, though, to specify that the European position is, I mean, Brussels does have is the kind of the representational of the EU, but in reality, majority of economic policy is shaped in Paris and Berlin. And like these two major centers, especially on this kind of trade policy issue, very, very, very significant influence from the French and German positions here. And at the moment, the Germans are a bit undecided on how to proceed with this. The French position has been pushed, is pretty much the major driver behind it. But I know more about Germany, so I'll stick to the German position. Germany is probably one of the most exposed countries in the world to Chinese economy. Just especially in the automotive industry. I think in 2021, German automotive companies accounted for 42% of all EU FDI into China. So they have a significant investment in production capacities here. And so they've been quite reluctant to act in similar to the American decoupling strategy. The major turning point for this, again, is really the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and not specifically this, but watching China's reaction and China's support of Russian invasion of Ukraine. So China is exporting more dual-use goods to Russia, which is really supporting their arms industry. And this is kind of a force, is kind of forcing German hands and German policies, strategic policy to reassess and kind of become more autonomous and kind of really take this Chinese engagement and Chinese connections and Chinese dependency a lot more seriously than they otherwise would. And you can see this in German policy, like in the German national security strategy, the climate foreign policy strategy that was recently released, and the strategy on China. But the language is still very globalist in its orientation. So Germany is really, really keen on having this globally open, liberalized system as much as possible. But it's kind of focusing on more non-traditional partners. Like you have the German Climate Club trying to engage these fair partnerships with other countries. And a lot of the language is very much on like fair and just partnerships with other countries so that they can extract value along the supply chain, whether it be in minerals or material production. So I think one key part of de-risking from China is not say less of China as much as it's more of other partners. And this is also more of other partners. And you can see this in different contexts. But I do appreciate, Alicia, the mentions of the German solar industry, and I just wanted to give some figures because it's something, it's a very, very, very good case to see what this can look like. In 2022, 95% of the solar panels in Germany came from China. But if you kind of look back in time, in the early 2000s, China was less than 1% of global production, where Germany was about half. The Saxony Solar Valley was it was like the Silicon Valley of the global solar industry. It was a huge production center, but within 10 years or so, it was essentially, well, and more or less wiped off the map, and a lot of facilities there closed down. There's loads of reasons behind it, but I mean, by the end of it, in 2012 or so, China had 150% of global production relative to global demand. So they were gearing up towards very, very large exports. And there was a European Commission investigation into it, but in response to the announcement of the European investigation, China immediately decided to launch anti-dumping and anti-subsidy probes into wine imports from the EU and potentially luxury exports or luxury car exports into China as well. So you can see this kind of poking at Paris and Berlin, and you can kind of see this is what at least what me and my colleagues have been concerned about within the current dynamics of battery exports and vehicle imports, because any kind of levy in these directions to push and prod French and German policymakers is something that China has a significant leverage over. And part of this comes on the reliance of exporting for German automotive exports to the Chinese market. So in this case, you think that reliance on Chinese tech is one thing, but also reliance on sale of green tech from European companies is another thing. So one of the major risks for German automotive companies might actually be incorporating Chinese technology into, say, the North American supply chain, because access to American market for German automotives, even in the case of German electric vehicles, is a significant market. So in this case, one way to decouple from or to de-risk the supply chain from a German perspective is to partner with, say, Korean or Japanese battery manufacturing in Canada or in Mexico or within the US. So this is one way to regionalize the supply chain, but it goes a little bit beyond that as well, because the Chinese automotive market's also changing quite rapidly. So historically, German automotive companies have been selling a lot of ICE internal combustion engines within the Chinese market, and as the share of EV penetration increases, their ICE sale model will become slightly less compatible, especially if you hit a potential ICE ban by 2035. But the exposure really changes dependent on company. So if it's a company like Tesla, even though it's not a German company, or like Volkswagen follows the model similarly, where you're producing them to be exported to Europe or otherwise global markets, you could have the risk of Chinese just essentially blocking exports, but that's not inherently that risky. Or you could have a company like BMW that's mostly invested in localized productions, where most of their vehicles are produced locally and then sold locally. So in this case, their exposure is a little less problematic. But I think in general that the important thing to going forward for at least German automotive companies in the case of green tech and depending on this is really, how do you balance engaging with the Chinese market and trying to sell, ideally sell electric vehicles there, but it's or compete with them on the global sense, because German automotive companies do have a significant lead within the ICE space. So them trying to sell EVs within the European context might require them to scale up production within Europe. However, how are they balancing that with scaling back internal combustion engine sales within Europe? I mean, or even exporting those models abroad. So in this case, you can see the Toyota strategy being a little bit interesting, because they haven't fully said that they're committing to phasing out internal combustion engines, right? But this is kind of where you see the complexities of the green industrial policy, at least within the German case. And I think that it's not very easy to look at it, because sales within Europe and European market production is one thing, but also competition for these global markets, even outside of the Chinese context, is something very, very interesting as well. So this is all on my end.
No, great. Thank you, Loyle. I appreciate you mentioning the complexities as well, because I think it goes to the complexities of de-risking in general, right? Like, different business models, different industries, different businesses have just different exposure to this. And it creates kind of a multi-stakeholder approach to de-risking that may shape its scale and its speed going forward. I definitely want to give Ilaria a chance to react to all these wonderful comments. And then I'm hoping that we can get into the EV probe as well before we conclude. Ilaria, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think there will be too many thoughts to be able to respond to everything. I think everybody had super interesting points to make. And I know, the paper itself obviously couldn't address everything because there's so many complex issues. I think one thing I did want to, highlight is that, the FDI issue, I think, is going to continue to be an issue even when we think about partnerships, right? And even in the paper, I mentioned that, of course, for example, with solar, one thing that Europe should look into doing is trying to explicitly support the development of alternative supply chains, for example, in Southeast Asia. But of course, a lot of those supply chains still are reliant on Chinese FDI, right? So I think there is, and of course, you see it now, Chinese FDI in Latin America, for example, in response to the IRA, certainly in Mexico, but, even, for example, in Chile in terms of refining. And so I think you continue to see that Chinese companies, the footprint of Chinese companies is expanding internationally. So that's why I pointed to, thinking about risk and what kind of risk you're trying to mitigate or addressing and how to prioritize which risk is most important, as a way of also having a framework of thinking about how to address these things and how to prioritize, for example, different approaches, whether they are, onshoring or partnerships or alternative supply chains, etc. And I think, that it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. I think an all of the above strategy is probably called for in a lot of cases, where you try to enhance your domestic industry. And I take Agatha's point seriously. And I think this is an important thing to remember, that actually getting your act together is sort of central to this, right? Because you can defend your industry as much as possible, but if that industry isn't innovating and becoming more competitive, then that's sort of a lost cause in many ways, right? So I think that's going to be important. But of course, also trying to think through what partnerships are available in order to have try and create those alternative supply chain, diversified supply chains, And of course, having interlocking systems, whether it is a broader market that can try and replicate that market advantage, or it's even when we are thinking about, this is taking a step beyond this, but when we're thinking about trade systems that are affecting climate, for example, the CBAM, or some of the proposals that have been announced here in the US, and thinking about how these things, the IRA, for example, how do these different systems speak to each other, and are they cohesive, are they coherent, are we thinking about international and geostrategic issues at the same time as we're thinking about industrial policy or the domestic economy. So I think that's just I think that's, in my mind, that's how these things all connect a little bit, and there's a lot more to be said. Of course, I think it all comes to a head with the anti-subsidy investigation. Again, I think here it's going to be interesting. I mean, I think what is particularly interesting is that the industries that, the companies that are supposed to be protected through this anti-subsidy investigation they've been very reticent, at least publicly, to be supportive of this. And I think that gets to what Loyle's been saying, where there is a lot of exposure, and there is a lot of interest in the Chinese economy still. So I'll leave it at that. But I think let Lily, back to you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Ilaria. Let's get into the EV probe. In October, the European Commission announced an anti-subsidy investigation into imports of passenger battery EVs made in China, and this is seen by some as an opening, or at least the highest profile signal or step, if you will, in increasing trade friction in this area between the EU and China. Agatha, I know you've got to leave at the top of the hour, so I want to turn it over to you. Your thoughts on where is this probe now? What's driving it? Where can it go from here?
Thank you. Well, where it is at the moment, I think it was really interesting that it was announced right before, it was announced at von der Leyen's State of the Union speech September 13th, and then opened October 4th formally, for very political reasons, but also to make a very strong point. The point being, I am in charge and will defend European competitiveness and European industry from unfair practices. I think it's been brewing for a long time. To be honest, we had been reading and hearing and understanding and seeing a lot of discomfort around the EV industry for a long while, and concerns mounting. And I think over the green tech industry, but certainly in the EV space, there was a little bit of a pause, and we didn't hear about it much until the summit, mostly and likely because I think the summit was an opportunity to discuss and see if China was ready to first and foremost acknowledge the concerns from the part of the EU, that didn't happen so much from what I understand, and then make a point that things, that the threat was credible, and then to say, well, if nothing happens that makes us comfortable that the situation is going to resolve in China, subsidies be rolled back, overcapacity be reined in, and that we'll be comfortable that exports of EVs to the European market won't disturb an industry that we're trying to build at the moment, then we'll move ahead. And from the signal I'm seeing coming out of the summit, I have very high expectation that something will happen in the first half of 2024, namely interim tariffs, most likely. Most likely this is the next step, right? Interim tariffs and then final tariffs. But in the first half of the year, before we get into the deadlock of EU elections, I wouldn't be surprised if interim tariffs were introduced. I wouldn't be surprised either, by the way, if more trade action or investment action of procurement action and defense was to be rolled out. We hear a lot about medical devices. We heard about wind. This is a little bit more up in the air thing because the case is a hard one to make. But there are other sectors that we should watch very closely. And of course, and you said it yourself, Ilaria, overcapacity is the name of the game for 2024. Everyone is worried about huge amounts of unused and unconsumed products from China finding their way to global markets, including the EU. And that could trigger yet more reaction. So that's something I would watch for.
Fantastic. Thank you, Agatha. I appreciate that update on where we are. And just so everyone knows, we're just going to go a few minutes over the hour because we started a bit late. Definitely want to hear from Alicia and Loyle on this. Alicia, I'll turn it over to you. And for both you and Loyle, I'd love to hear, my assessment is that reaction to this probe was not uniformly positive, certainly not in China, but also among some European stakeholders. I think it really illustrates kind of the multi-stakeholder nature of some of these decisions that will be that will have to be taken along the de-risking path. Would love to hear your thoughts there on some of the reactions we're seeing from the key stakeholders, including the European ones. Alicia, over to you.
I think I would say that when the investigation was announced, yes, there were like dissonant voices, clearly. But as we move on and we find, we basically realized that even with such threat in mind, with a lot of a growing trade deficit, with a very difficult situation in Europe, nothing seems to happen. I think we are seeing more of an alignment on the need for action. And I think this is something that is driving the Commission, because yes, there was some dissonance, but if you bear with me, it's not loud enough. It's not loud enough. Which means it's just that, nominally you want to show that dissonance. Yeah, I mean, you look good, put it this way, but I don't think it's real. And I've never seen, I mean, if you look at if you listen to the press conference, after the summit, I mean, even there was no dissonance, which there would have been, in the past between Charles Michel and van der Leyen. You could see that this is becoming political, that is becoming serious, that is not only a trade issue. It's I would say even a core issue for Europe. Let's face it, it's 15 million jobs in the auto industry. So, and it affects so many countries. The auto industry is everywhere in Europe. So, it's like touching bone, if you ask me. I mean, yes, there are voices, but the reality is nobody wants to lose those jobs, and you can tell. And I think it's also important to that signal that it was the Commission, not a company like in the solar panel case, opening the case. It's political. It's becoming a political. So frankly, I'm not expecting, to your question, any member state in Europe to go diverge in a way that this investigation can't go on, as it happened with the solar panels, and I'm sorry to say Germany in 2014. I don't foresee that. It's just too important.
Great, I appreciate that. I'd love to get your thoughts, Loyle, on this, comparing to the solar case here. How you expect member states, particularly Germany, to engage here?
I think Germany is more or less trying to be as quiet as possible, because I think that Germany, I mean, there's definitely some voices within Germany that don't like it, but there's definitely some that do support it. But in general, as far as I've seen from major political figures like Habeck and Baerbock, they're not particularly vocal on it. They've been pushing other issues. They're just, as far as I'm concerned, they don't really want to. This goes back with, for example, like the Holy See was able to resolve a religious issue with China kind of behind the scenes, and I think that this might be a good example where it is better to just be quiet and try to move the conversation along without provoking the wolf warrior diplomacy and all of this other stuff, and just without dragging attention to it, because you generally have more ability to engage with China on a political level footing if you're not kind of shouting at it, at least in my own analysis. But I do think that it's not, that there are definitely voices within the German automotive industry that are actively not that happy about it, but I think the political figures do definitely see the risks associated with it. Also, they see the risks of not kind of towing the line, especially in terms of like the Zeitenwende and like actually developing a coherent response to Chinese industrial policy. I think that just in terms of their own credibility and political legitimacy, they're kind of obliged to have some kind of action on China. Whether or not, but if they can outsource that to Brussels and the French, then I think that might be politically convenient. But I do think, though, that this is just kind of a first step. And as I was mentioning, I think that it's also important to think that European automotives are major exporters, and this is why I mentioned that. I mean, Toyota's not fully transitioning to electric vehicles. They still plan to make internal combustion engines well into the future. And I think that conversation about how European automotives and European green tech competes with China outside of Europe in other major markets or other emerging markets is also an interesting part of the conversation, because exporting European automotive market is a big market, but I mean, other emerging markets are significant as well. And I think that's where the conversation will become a lot more complicated, because this is where Alicia mentioned, I really appreciated her mentioning that they still need to innovate. Protecting European market is great. European market is great and all the power to you, but like double-digit growth figures in like the emerging economies is a major opportunity to sell things. And if the Chinese are coming in with an opportunity of $10,000 for a BYD rather than a $25,000 or euros for something from Volkswagen or Tesla, I think that in this case, structured technology partnerships with the Chinese might actually make sense, because you can learn from how they cut costs, how they scale things. But this shows that again, it's an all-the-above strategy, because the European market might require different solutions than third market economy, or not China, EU, US market economies, right? I mean, the strategy is going to be very, very complex, and I think that a lot of this stuff is going to change and evolve as the situation changes as well.
Great, and I wish we had a lot more time to dig into these issues. This hour has passed too quickly. Ilaria, I want to turn it over to you for any final thoughts. And maybe if you could touch on very briefly just how you're looking at the transatlantic comparison here in terms of how this EV probe is being seen in Washington.
Yeah, thank you. That's very relevant, because the next paper I'll be writing will be on the U.S. and some of the trade-offs that the U.S. is facing in the climate sort of trade space. So certainly I am looking at the comparison here. I think that in a way the United States benefits from an economy that's done fairly well over the past few years. It benefits from the IRA, which obviously has provided significant economic support to these industries. I think that's actually, been a source of tension with the European Union, because of the sense that may have distorted markets a little bit and certainly attracted investment away from Europe. That's at least the concern there. But of course, the United States faces a even more fraught relationship with with China, which I think is shaping and politicizing a lot of the foreign direct investment that may be coming in these areas. So while you don't see you're seeing investment in certain factories in Michigan, the Goshen factory, for example, and the CATL Ford deal, which has come under significant fire for political, because of political concerns, even when these investments have not been necessarily illegal. And so I think there is a sort of a fight looming over exactly how to think about risk in the United States in an environment that is even more fraught politically. So that's, I think, part of the comparison there. I think the other thing to think about is the transatlantic relationship. And I think here it is sort of striking how many challenges we've seen in coming to an agreement over Gaza. And I think that it is striking because, of course, there is such a strong, security relationship between the United States and its European partners, and it's not been matched by an economic partnership. And so I think there's going to have to be a lot more, a lot more of another balancing act of a different kind that's going to have to come into play. And I think that's going to be important moving forward and thinking more about the transatlantic relationship.
Perfect, Ilaria. I think that's a great note to end on. And I do appreciate you mentioning the Chinese investment in the United States, because I think those are some really interesting cases that will be fascinating to watch, because a lot of the reaction and the pushback to them has been happening at the local level, similar to investments outside the clean tech space where local communities have really organized to stop these investments. That would be interesting to look at in Europe, as in the European case as well. But there's so much more to discuss here. We'll have to arrange another discussion once you have your new report. And I think we've really dug into how, you know, the de-risking equation is so complex. We've got to think about different types of clean technology. We've got to think about different types of exchange, whether it's inbound investment, Chinese imports, scientific collaboration. We've also got to think about different parts of the supply chain. And Alicia, you mentioned, you know, we go from extraction, refining, manufacturing, innovation. All of these different parts of the supply chain are being thought about here. So I hate to end on a note that it's all complex, but I think that means that there's lots more to research. And I really appreciate our panelist time. Ilaria, fantastic report. I encourage everyone to go look at it, Balancing Act, on the CSIS page. And I appreciate all our audience for joining us today. Thank you.